Welcome to today's lecturette. I'm Dr. Leslie Jones, and today's focus is on establishing and maintaining relationships with families. You may well have heard the saying that a child's first and most influential teacher is the child's parents. You may also have heard the saying from Reggio Emilia, it takes a village to raise a child. And I think both are true and highly relevant to today's topic and highlight the socially connected ways in which families and the broader community have a critical role to play to ensure that children have the best start in life. As someone intending to work with children and families, it's really critical that you understand how families function and the influences that may impact on their capacity and efficacy to support their children. If we think about families in contemporary Australia, families are recognised in significantly diverse ways from where they have been generationally and over history and time. Today, from two-parent to step to single to same-sex to sibling to childless, we recognise that families can be formed in many diverse ways. Regardless of how families are formed, sustained and changed, contemporary research really supports that it's the functioning of the family, how well the family actually functions, rather than its structure, that is more impactful on child outcomes. And that's a shift from research from decades before, where the types of family structures were actually seen as a risk factor for children. We now know that how those structures actually work is far more important. In earlier lecturettes, we spoke about the microsystem in Bronfenbrenner's ecological systems theory. It's here that those proximal processes of the members of the child's family unfold and exert a direct influence on the child's development and overall lived experiences. The interactions and the relationships that are established and maintained with the family through the mesosystem act as the enablers or barriers to some of the family processes that we know support child outcomes. Getting to know children and families is one of the most rewarding aspects of working in this field. Investing in the time to establish relationships and to understand where families have come from and supporting them through the pressures of raising young children is a worthwhile and critical focus of your professional practice. Understanding the concept of family is a social construction. That is, it's built over time through millions of interactions and accepted shared social understandings within a society. However, building a relationship with a real-life family is a personal investment of time and effort. So I want us to consider, how do you get to know someone and get to know someone really well? Of course, there's no one correct answer, but understanding the personal backgrounds, the prior experiences, and the future focus of a family is a good place to begin. Long before you encounter them, your families you'll be working with have had thousands of experiences, good and not so good, that have shaped who they are as a family, what they're looking for, and what they hope for their children. From a social constructivist perspective, the interactions and relationships they've had with other educators and professionals will have built a picture for them of who you are before they get to know you, just as the relationships you will have with other families have helped to build your picture of what families are like to you. This social construction of understanding is a continuous process and one that we need to be cognizant of, as it underpins the quality of the relationships that you will establish. We need to recognise that the picture that we build up of families is a generalised one, and so we can't take the biases or the bad experiences or perceptions or assumptions around other families that worked with and apply it too deeply to the new families that we're trying to establish a relationship with. Families may seem similar to each other, but each family deserves to be met and understood for the unique unit that they are, with their own history, their own challenges, and their own strengths. This provides us with a strong building block of authentic relationships and genuine interest in their journey as a family. The most proximal influence on the developing child in Bronfenbrenner's model is the relationship with their primary caregivers, and it's in this rhythm of relationships that the quality of attachment between child and adult is established. The establishment of relationships between primary caregivers and children incorporates the child's temperament, the quality of the attachment between primary caregiver and the child, and the parenting styles that are present. Let's briefly look at parenting styles and attachment. Attachment theory has produced some seminal work that is outlined in your text, including that of Bowlby and Ainsworth. But in a broad sense, this research has identified that there are some predictable types of attachment, including secure, insecure, and disorganised patterns of attachment. When attachment processes are working well, the primary caregiving adult is able to provide that notion around safe haven for children to retreat to in times of stress. And alternatively, at times of low risk, caregivers can act as a secure base from which children can explore the environment and people around them. And the degree to which children either retreat or explore depends in a large part on the level and type of attachment that that child has with their primary caregiver. However, in a broader sense, being a parent requires adults to undertake a range of practical and pastoral roles with their children, like providing support, encouragement, and discipline and boundaries. And the research around these types of activities have highlighted 4 observable parenting styles that include permissive, authoritarian, and authoritative, and indifferent parenting styles in more recent times. It's important to note that some critique of these categories have occurred, claiming that they tend to be fairly sweeping generalisations and that they don't hold up well in cross-cultural contexts. Regardless, it's pretty safe to say that in general, the normal ways in which parents approach their role as parents is an important element of the quality of the relationships that is established. I'd like to take a moment to step away from the relationships between primary caregivers being parents and children, and to begin to explore what that attachment theory and relationships is relevant for in terms of your role as a professional working with young children. Recent research definitely shows us that the notion around secure attachments and the ability to provide children with a safe haven or a secure base of attachment patterns and the relationships that underpin that are just as important between infants and young children and their educators and teachers as it is with their parents and families. We see that reflected in documents like the National Quality Standards in Quality Area 5 that calls out the importance of the types of relationships that we have with children. And this document, the National Quality Standards, is the overarching document that talks about what does quality look like and service delivery in the early years and prior to school sector. Not surprisingly, the NQS also calls out that the relationships with families are another crucial determinant in the overall service delivery quality. This is not surprising given that we also now recognise that the relationship between infants and caregivers is a critical determinant for later social, emotional well-being and cannot be firewalled to simply the relationships that children have with their families. In a contemporary environment, we know that children spend extended periods of time in out-of-home care, such as childcare centres, family daycare, and other group setting environments such as kindies. Knowing that children spend large periods of time outside of the home, it has become clearly obvious that the quality of relationships, the quality of attachments, and the quality of approaches and styles towards working with children is equally relevant and important for those professionals working with young children as it is indeed for their families. The physiological resources that a parent is able to draw upon influences the overall quality of the parenting that they can engage in. Risk factors include things like mental health of the parents themselves. Depressive and mood disorders can compromise a parent's ability to establish bonded relationships with their children and is a growing concern in most Australian communities. The past history of a parent, including their own exposure to child abuse, is also a well-established concern for repeatable behaviours with their own children that are undesirable. The level of parental education has been shown in numerous studies to be a determinant of the overall parenting quality that is offered and that children are exposed to, as is the negative impact of sustained poverty and financial stress. And again, we need to consider how many of our communities have families who are operating under that sort of pressure, under the financial pressure of mortgage stress, unemployment, and all of the factors that impact their ability to financially be independent and able to cope. And a final aspect that impacts on the quality of parenting is the temperament of the child themselves. Temperament, we know, is a relatively stable characteristic of child development and includes categories such as easy children, difficult children, and slow to warm up. And when we think about those types of temperament that we see in children, parents with diminished psychological resources and, say, for instance, particularly having to parent a difficult child, a child with a temperament where they're fussy or they won't sleep or they cry excessively, those parents are going to face significant challenges that may not be present if the mix between psychological resources and temperament were different. Parents who are not working with depleted psychological resources can cope with those sorts of challenges better. So the quality of parenting is really determined by the interplay between their psychological resources and the temperament of the child, and the other stuff that we've spoken about as risk factors. So their own mental health, their own background, their level of education, their level of financial stability. Those are the sorts of things that coalesce together to produce the overall quality of the parenting experience for the child. But I think it's also really important to recognise that the influence on a parent's ability to cope are not fixed. Things like financial stress and anxiety, a sense of confidence or a sense of efficacy about their ability to parent, or depressive episodes can tend to wax and wane over the lifetime of a family. Just because a parent may be anxious as a new parent does not mean that they'll remain anxious as their child actually grows. As a working professional, you'll encounter many parents who, at the time, may need extra support to cope with the parenting challenges that they are facing at the time. Understanding that these issues can be transient and in the vast majority of cases are absolutely recoverable is an important perspective for you to hold on to as you engage with and support families in your local communities. And finally, I'd like to finish today's lecturette just making the point about how important it is the way that you see families. It matters a whole lot. In earlier lecturettes, I made the point that the likelihood of you working only with families from a similar background to your own is a little bit remote. The values and beliefs that you bring to the table about children and about families is really heavily grounded in your own lived experience and potentially and hopefully expanded through your formal studies here at university. The values and beliefs that you hold about children, childhood and families will influence the ways in which you position children and families, what sort of power relationships you will establish with those children and families. Your values and beliefs will influence the way in which you form judgments about children and of children and their families, and subsequently then the types of relationships and interactions that you will establish with them. Interestingly, for most people, our values and belief systems are an implicit position. We seldom bring them out and really talk about them openly and check whether or not they're relevant for a contemporary professional to be drawing upon. Yet, they're a really persistent and pervasive influence on the ways that you're going to be working with children and families. So it's absolutely crucial that you begin to examine your values and belief systems about children and about families with a critical eye to check for the relevance and the congruence with the sort of professional work that you will be undertaking and the type of professional that you aspire to become. Thank you for spending time with me today as we've explored this notion around relationships with families, and I look forward to our next session as we continue to explore more broadly children, families and communities.